This happened about 3 years ago, so I was 16 at the time. I remember it being a warm day, sometime in September. I was off work that day and decided to go hang out with my best friend. We'll call her Abby. I had just gotten my license in the spring of that year, so I was pretty excited to be driving around town. I got to Abby's house and we were trying to figure out something to do. We decided that we didn't want to go out with friends and instead make dinner for Abby's mom and stepdad. So we got in the car and went to Walmart to grab some ingredients for dinner and grab some cake mix on the way out. While we were there, we noticed there was a guy, maybe mid-50s, that we were constantly walking past over and over again in the store, but we didn't really pay much mind to it because it was pretty busy in there. We checked out and started heading over to my car when we noticed that the same guy packing his groceries into his truck. I remember looking over at Abby and saying something along the lines of, "Oh, is that your new boyfriend? Or why don't you go get his number?" We both laughed, maybe a little too loud because it caught the dude's attention as we were walking by him. He looked back at us and we both knew we messed up by being loud. He turns around and tells us our hair is beautiful and asked us if we were sisters. We told him we were, thanked him for his compliment, and told him to have a good day. Honestly, in our part of town, it's quite common for dudes to compliment whatever girls they see, so we were used to it and just brushed it off. We get into the car, I obviously lock the doors, and we start laughing about the guy, talking about how creepy his eyes looked. Now, it looks like the guy watched Abby and I walk to my car, I'm guessing, because he ended up driving the opposite way of the exit to drive slowly behind my car. I saw his face looking at my car in my rear view, looked at Abby and went, "Holy shit, it's the same creep." We both broke out in laughter, making fun of him once again. He had already driven off by this point, so we do too. We get home, make food, and have a good night's sleep. Normal days go by and I forget about the situation. Until one day, while I'm at work, I'm running food from table to table, helping out the servers at my job, and I bring food to a table who looked particularly surprised to see my face. I didn't recognize the guy at first until I saw his eyes, and realized who the hell I was talking to. I place the food down, ask if he needs anything else, and scurry off to the bathroom to tell Abby what just happened. Hours go by and he's still sitting at the bar, cranking back beers alone. I told my coworkers about the dude and they were like, he's probably just lonely. My manager tells me to go home since it's slow, so I clock out and leave. As I'm walking to my car, I hear the restaurant door swing open and there he is, trailing behind me, telling me to talk to him. I stop and turn around and he says, "So, does a pretty lady like you have a boyfriend?" I tell him that I do and that my boyfriend works with me, which was a lie. He proceeds to get closer to the point where I can smell the alcohol on his breath. His eyes get big and he says, "Would you mind if me and you became friends?" At this time I was totally creeped out and told the guy I was 16, hoping he'd back off after hearing my age. Unfortunately, I think all that did was make him more interested. I tell him I need to go and that it was nice to meet him and walk away. I can still hear him murmuring under his breath. The guy was really drunk. He watches me get into my car and I drive away. I was totally freaked out by the guy and ended up telling Abby over the phone and telling my mom once I got home. She told me to keep my eyes open from now on because this guy was obviously interested in underage girls and doesn't care where he is when he finds a girl he likes. A week passes and I go to work again and there he is, sitting at the bar, throwing back beers again. I tell my manager that I am not running food to his particular area and I tell her my background with the guy. She understands and sends me to work on the register. I see the guy waltz over to the restroom and slam the door open so loud that the whole restaurant looks over and goes silent. He looks back at the silence he created and sees me once again. I was so over this guy I didn't even care and just walked over to the kitchen to hide by the cooks. The guy heads back to the bar after his bathroom performance and orders food. 10 minutes pass by and the local police come in asking my manager to see last Saturday's camera footage. She walks into the office with the cops and all the staff is pretty confused. About 40 minutes later, the cops walk over to the bar and arrest the same old creep. I watched in glee as that sucker was put in handcuffs. I ran over to my manager and asked her what happened. Apparently the guy was under investigation for spiking a young woman's drink at my restaurant, and the cameras caught him red-handed after the woman filed a police report the next morning. I haven't seen this guy since, except in my nightmares. Hopefully he's still rotting in jail somewhere, getting some help from his weird fetishes. Last June, some girlfriends and I had decided to go on a trip to Chicago for a music festival. My brother lives about 20 minutes out of Chicago but works in the city. For one of the days we had rode the train in with him, he went to work and we floundered the city touring until he was done. Midday, we decided to go to his work and visit him as he worked in one of the buildings a couple blocks from the Chicago Bean. When we got into the building, we got to the second floor and were greeted by some front desk ladies. We stood there texting my brother to come down, and we were met with him showing him pictures of our touring trips so far. I noticed a man coming up the escalator, and I instantly had a very odd feeling about him. Not to be stereotyped, but I had the vibe he either was not fully there or maybe was on some type of substance. Instantly, the front desk ladies had approached him and told him, "You know you can't be up here, we told you this, sir." Clearly, this wasn't their first rodeo with this guy. I tried to focus on my brother talking to us, but I couldn't help but notice this guy was locked in staring at us while these ladies were trying to escort him back out. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed he just stood there looking at us. Eyes literally looked black, and his arms crossed, not saying anything. My friend standing at the other end of our group immediately caught on as well and audibly said, "Hey, we should go, like, right now." Her noticing this as well creeped me out because I thought I was just being dramatic. We quickly went down the opposite side of the building, and my other two friends were confused and did not pick up on what me and my friend were talking about. I told them I'd explain once we'd gotten out of the building. We began walking down the sidewalk, and I explained to my other two friends what I had felt from this guy. I glanced over, panicked that we might have been followed, and sure enough, on the opposite side of the road, on the sidewalk, he was walked with his arms crossed, head slightly cocked, dead eyes staring at us, walking. I now had full body chills, not because he had given me any reason, but because of his demeanor. I had genuinely felt like he knew we were afraid, and he was feeding off of it. Also, he just had this genuine malice vibe coming from him. I scrambled to tell my friends the situation, and we started to kind of darting between tourists and blocks to lose him. I was just freaked out because we had come from small town Minnesota and we'd seen drug addicts before, but this didn't feel like some random tweaker. He had the scariest vibe. To this day, we all still talk about it because it freaked us out so bad. I know it's not a lot of physical story, but it's so much more of a you had to be there to experience how he actually felt vibe-wise. I always say Chicago has some very weird energy and people in it. I'm a young female and was going for a run on a popular trail. I typically feel safe running there, despite it being somewhat secluded, because there are normally a lot of people. But on this day, there were not as many people as usual because of a town event. I parked, and as I was getting out of my car, I noticed some really loud, intense music which I found odd for the setting. I glanced over and saw a man in a white pickup truck who was staring at me from his side mirror, with his car running and music playing. He then immediately put his car in drive and drove off. I found it odd and a bit creepy, but figured he must have been a man coming back from a run and was listening to pump-up music or something. I then walked over to the trail entrance, but realized my shoe was untied. I bent down and was behind a bush to tie my shoe, out of sight from the parking lot. I noticed the same truck drive down the road, U-turn, and then return to the parking lot. It was the same guy, only now his music parted off. He parked again, now across from my car, and sat in his car. If I hadn't stopped to tie my shoe, I don't think I would have noticed. This was when I went into fight or flight mode. I wasn't sure what to do and was too scared to go back to my car, as there was no one else in the parking lot. I hid behind the bush for about 10 minutes until I saw another hiker down the trail. I explained the situation and asked if he would walk me back to my car. Thankfully, he was so kind and understanding. When I got back to the parking lot, the man in the truck got out but then froze. I don't think he noticed the hiker who walked back with me at first. I then got in my car and drove off, and the hiker who helped me returned to hiking. I was really shaken by the whole thing, but also was wondering if I was just being paranoid. I just can't explain the man's actions. I genuinely want to understand why he would drive away only to immediately return to the parking lot to sit there for 10 minutes. When I was 13 years old, I used to leave the school during lunch break and accompany my friend as she would eat her lunch at home, a custom in UK schools, and then come back to school once lunch had ended. I wasn't supposed to eat lunch from home, but managed to trick the teachers, and this was due to being pressured by my friend to join her. Her house was only a 2-minute walk, and I remember you had to pass by an alleyway which looked very creepy, and any time we walked past the alleyway I would get this unsettling feeling. One day it was a Friday and I really didn't want to leave with my friend, but she would peer pressure me all the time. I remember the weather being really bad. It was raining heavily. The sky looked gray and dull, and there was huge wind outside. I kept telling my friend that we should just stay at the school, but she insisted we go to her house. We exited the school gates and walked up the street to head to the alley, which you had to get to the top of the street and then turn left. I was casually walking, and my friend was no longer beside me. She had this deer in headlights look, and she was frozen still. I could see a guy walking towards our direction who was covered in all black and only his eyes were visible. My friend tapped me in the shoulder and gestured for me to turn around, and she started speed walking with me closely behind her. It didn't take us long at all to get back to the school as we were already near the area, and my friend started running as soon as we reached the gates and screamed loudly. I freaked out and asked her what was wrong, and she told me that the man was carrying a knife. I remember being visibly freaked out, and we told a friend about it who had us speak to these teachers, who then called the police. The police took our statements separately while we were both at home, but later stated we were lying because our answers didn't match up. I don't remember the exact questions, but I remember the wording was confusing. They would ask me how many feet the man was away from us and would tell me to compare my answer to a bus or a car. They did check the CCTV footage and saw both me and my friend running, but no footage of the man. Years later, I would be haunted by that incident. The whole area used to freak me out, and I remember a murder happening in the same year where 2 elderly women were stabbed to death. During my early 20s, I used to do voluntary work at a hospital, and once decided to go walk in that area to go home. And I felt freaked out and decided not to go there again. I matched with a man on Tinder one day. The conversation got spicy and I gave him my number so we can continue chatting. We texted that night. We never exchanged photos or nudes or anything like that. Never made plans to meet up. The conversation died and I forgot about him. Weeks go by and I deleted the conversation. Then, late one night, I get a lewd photo of a man I don't recognize. I think of insulting them but decide to just delete it and not respond. A few weeks later I get another one. I have the idea to check my deleted messages to make sure I don't know them. Sure enough, I find out it's the Tinder guy. It's really weird of them to text me a month later just lewd images after no contact or anything for a month. So I blocked them. A couple of weeks later I get a lewd video on my Apple Watch. It's the same guy. I'm not sure how I got the message on my watch if I already blocked his number. I block him again on my watch. A week later, I leave my apartment to go on a walk, and there he is, right there in front of my apartment walking towards me. He has the same outfit as his profile photos and the same tattoos and hats, so I'm certain it's him. I never mentioned where I lived, so I'm obviously freaked out. But I'm dressed in baggy clothes and recently changed up my hair color, so I keep my head down in hopes he doesn't recognize me. I walk right past him. I was too scared to look at him to see his reaction if he recognized me. I was too scared to look back in his direction to see where he went, so I just kept walking forward. I was severely freaked out, but nothing else happened after that, and I never saw him again. I never mentioned where I lived, so my only thought is he must have used my phone number to look me up. It was the least likely person I would have expected. Just some random person I messaged for only one day on Tinder. Even with the lewd content they sent, I still just thought they were a regular perv. I never expected them to somehow show up at my apartment. They didn't even text a word to me or attempt to meet up. They just sent lewds over 2 months and then appear. It's just so random and weird. I think their motive was definitely something sexually perverted. It gives me the creeps to think about what they wanted, but I'm glad they left me alone. I never give out my real cell phone number to dates anymore. From age 13 until almost 15, I had a paper route. I delivered papers to people's doors 6 days a week. All of my customers, aside from occasional grumps and chatterboxes, were absolutely wonderful. Most of them were older, and so many of them were so happy to see me every day just to have someone to talk to. Many of them will leave me granola bars, water bottles, and even tips. Winter holidays were a great time because everyone who could left huge tips. It was a pretty good first official job. Eventually, some of the snowbirds moved back and became my customers. One couple, Louise and Gerald, will always stick out in my mind. They started off normal, pretty friendly people, but I noticed one Sunday, the only day I had to get up early to deliver papers, that Gerald was outside. He chatted me up, nothing unusual. Because it was so early and because I'd usually go right to bed after I was done, I was wearing a Britney Spears shirt and a pair of polar bear pajama pants. He complimented and said I was dressed cutely. I was confused because it was pajamas I just threw on randomly. I was confused by the compliment, but I just went on about my day and didn't think much of it. Something else to note, his wife Louise was always smiling. I couldn't pinpoint why, but it always unnerved me. In retrospect, it gives me the meek and mild and subservient tradwife vibes. Anyways, I had noticed that in their garden there were 3 different dog headstones that all said Fido on it. I was kinda confused as to why they all had the same name, but I figured maybe multiple people had bought them and they wanted to be polite so they put them out anyways. One day, Louise was out and she had a dog with her. She introduced the dog to me as they had just adopted her. And guess what? They named her Fido. All of the dogs they had were named Fido, and they were all Shelties. Just like that one. I thought this was weird and I told my mom about it, and she told me not to be so judgmental, as it was probably one way they dealt with grief. Here's the thing, they kept trying to get me to come inside. They'd invite me in for tea, which is not really something people do where I'm from. Coffee and donuts is a little more commonplace, but even that isn't something people do on a regular basis. Or they'd invite me in to talk to them. I'd always decline because I had more papers to deliver and I wanted to go home. Gerald kept complimenting my outfits, even when they were pajamas. One morning he did this while getting closer to me, and eventually touching my shoulder, and I was eventually like, I gotta go, and left. I didn't tell my mom at the time, as our relationship was good at that point, and I feared that telling her of any concerns that I had would make her not trust me, or make her mad. This was also at the tail end of my CSA, which she doesn't know about to this day. I thought maybe I was just paranoid. Then, right before I moved and gave up my paper route, a really bizarre incident happened. It was a Sunday, the last Sunday I had the paper route to be exact. So I was out early delivering papers. It was still kind of dark out, and Gerald was outside. He complimented my outfit again, getting all creepily close. He invited me inside, and I said I really don't think my mom would appreciate me being gone for longer than she expects me to. She's strict, which wasn't the whole truth, but you gotta do what you gotta do. He seemed to get kind of annoyed and just asked, "Wouldn't your mom just prefer that you respect your elders and not turn down an invitation?" I felt the color drain from my face and I noped out so quick. I muttered something about how I really had to hurry along because my dog was sick. I heard him say some compliments about how my hair looked pretty. I have very wavy or curly hair that gets very puffy and very voluminous when I'm in the humidity, and he would bring it up a lot, saying that my hair reminded him of the 80s. I booked it as quickly as I could to the next house without running. I didn't see Gerald after that, but I did see Louise, and she never stopped inviting me to come inside and play with Fido, or have tea. I always declined them. She seemed disappointed every time. So, that's my weird paper route story. Maybe I'm paranoid, but Gerald and Louise had some funky vibes. This is a story from a while back when I was like 6 or 7. I don't remember the age I was exactly, but I remember the incident very clearly. It was when me and my family were living with my grandparents at the time, as they had a very big house. The house was 5 stories high, and only the second floor was occupied, while the whole house was left untouched except the first floor, which was a go-down, and the rest of the floors were empty with just big hallways and old wooden doors. The house was an old house with those old interlocking metal chain gates at every floor, which were locked by chains by my grandfather. And the house or complex was located in the middle of the main market of my city. Before 9 p.m. at night, the markets were full of life and the sounds of vehicles. But after 9:30, the whole market shuts down and the place becomes like a vacant graveyard, and it stays that way until 6:30 in the morning. This is all important for later. One night, the whole market shuts down as usual, and my grandfather started chaining the metal gate. Everything was ordinary until then. After me and all my family went to sleep at 10 or 11, my grandfather heard the sound of someone fidgeting with the lock on the chain. Not the one which opens the downstairs, but the one which opens the gate to the upstairs. My grandfather shouted that, "OP, don't play with the gate and go to sleep." This is roughly translated from Old Hindi to English, so this isn't the exact thing that he said. My grandfather swore that he heard the footsteps of someone running upstairs, with the lock loudly hitting the steel gate and creating a loud sound. After hearing this, my grandfather grabbed his stick and torch and walked to the door, and shined his torch, and he swore that he saw someone's leg. He screamed, waking every one of us up. My mom rushed us to see what happened to my grandfather. After that, he fell backwards and leaned on the wall, scared as the torch fell on the ground. He was scared because in the same house, as it was very big, my grandfather gave the house to someone to rent, and he lived there for a few years, after which he killed himself in the same room by hanging. My grandfather found the body after 3 days. The incident really shook him. After that rough 12 to 13 years, after he saw someone in his house, which really fucked with his mental health and made him paranoid for the last few years of his life. Sometimes after that, everyone swore that they heard sounds of footsteps dragging and of things falling down from upstairs through the air ducts. And after that, for a period of time, 3 to 5 years, my grandfather and grandmother lived in the same house alone, and at night he said he saw ghosts and snakes. One last bit of evidence I have that the shit that happened that night was true. For a few days, me and my cousins were staying there, and 2 days in a row we found the second floor opened and the chain on the stairs. Also after that, when we were selling the house to someone else, me and my siblings went to check the floors one last time, and a door leading to the balcony door was broken, and the wood was scattered all throughout the 3rd floor and the stairs to the 4th floor, which were chained and locked up. This happened when I was a junior in high school. My first period class was English, and that day we were supposed to workshop our essays, only I hadn't written mine. So as a lazy teenager, I decided I'd avoid the embarrassment by skipping my English class and using that time to work on my paper. I got up and left like I would any other day, but halfway there I was pulled into an empty parking lot by the river where people launch their boats. It was 8 in the morning, so obviously nobody was taking their boat out there, but there were a few cars in the lot for whatever reason. I parked away from the few cars, took out my laptop, and started working. After 15 or so minutes, I paused and looked out my window and saw several spots across from me. There was an older man staring right at me. It was hard to tell, but from distance it looked like he was smiling. Thinking we both just looked over at the same time, I gave him a small smile and went back to work. I sit there and work for probably another 10 or so minutes before taking another pause and look over to see the old man has moved his car just one spot away from mine and was again staring right at me with that creepy grin. At this point, alarm bells are going off. He's creeped me out enough that I turn on my car and move to the other side of the lot. I keep an eye on him for a couple of minutes, but he never moves his car, so I go back to working. I keep an eye on him for a couple minutes, but he never moves his car, so I go back to working. I work for another 20 or so minutes, getting into a good rhythm, so I was completely absorbed and began to forget about the man. It was getting close to the time my class would get out, so I start to put away my stuff and begrudgingly prepare to make my way to the school. But before I turn my car back on, my heart sinks when I look to my left to see the man now parked directly beside me. I had been so absorbed I somehow didn't notice him pull up, but there he was, staring right at me with an even bigger smile. All I could do in that moment was stare back at this guy. I was so creeped out and confused at the same time. Why is this guy following me? Has he been looking at me for the near hour I had been there? After a few moments of eye contact, I snap out of it, and at the same moment he starts to roll down his window. I was out of there. I put my car in reverse and exited that parking lot as fast as possible. But as I turned left out of the lot, I gave one last look at his car and another chill ran down my spine when I saw him waving at me with that creepy-ass smile. All I could think was, please don't follow me or I don't know what I'd do. Thankfully, he didn't follow me and I've never seen him again, but I'll always remember that feeling I had when I looked up and saw him parked right next to me. I don't know what he wanted or why he was obsessed with me, but the whole thing still creeps me out. A few weeks ago, I was driving in the middle of nowhere heading back to one of my friends. My wife was sleeping next to me while my teenage daughter was watching a movie in the back. Next to them, my toddler was playing with his toys. It was around 1 a.m. and I was nervous as the drive there seemed to last forever. The dirt road with no lights gave me chills as all I could see around were only fields. The road had many holes and I was trying to avoid them as much as I could. I was very focused on that when I saw in front of the car some luggage. It was in the middle of the road on my side. On the other side, a car was parked facing us. The car was completely in the dark as there were no lights inside or outside of it. I didn't want to drive over the luggage, so my first instinct was to go out and move it. I was lucky to have my wife with me. She grabbed my hand and indicated me something on the right. One person was in the field, looking sometimes at his phone, reason for which my wife saw him. I turned my car around and I was ready to leave this road when two people jumped in front of us. There was no space on the road, so I couldn't go without harming them. Two people were in front of my car, one luggage, a car, and the person checking their phone in the field were behind us. I did not know what to do, so I did the only thing that I thought of. I just turned around again, facing the luggage, and drove over it. Fortunately, there was nothing inside of it to damage my car, so we got out of this situation completely unharmed. We arrived at my friend's house, and everything was perfect and we had a great time there. However, I still have chills when I'm thinking about this incident. My girlfriend, 2 kids, 4 and 3, and myself were tent camping in eastern Washington one summer at a campground. It was a nice campground, but not many guests at all since it was before peak season. We had a site with no other campers visible to us. One night at approximately 1 a.m., my now ex-girlfriend and I were sitting by the fire while our kids were sleeping in the big tent that we were all sharing. A beat-up old Ford Explorer slowly drove by our campground and proceeded to keep driving around the campground out of sight. I thought it was odd, but maybe just someone looking for friends or a campsite. We went to bed and I woke up early the next morning, maybe 5 a.m. to go to the bathroom. And there was the same beat-up Ford Explorer at the campsite adjacent to ours, maybe 60 feet away. And mind you, there were dozens of other open campsites, so my alarms were certainly raised by this. After going to the bathroom and returning to our tent, where my kids and girlfriend were still asleep, I saw a man standing behind the Ford Explorer with only his head visible, trying to hide himself, looking directly at my tent. I stood there and stared right back at him for about 45 seconds and raised my hands up in the air like, "What the f*** are you looking at?" I didn't want to cause a commotion and wake the kids up, and he just continued to stare. I sat in one of my camp chairs and kept eyes on him and watched him get into his car, which was facing us, but I couldn't see what he was doing in there. About an hour later, he started his car up and slowly drove right by our site and stared directly at me, maintaining eye contact the entire pass, which was about 25 feet away. I know for a fact this guy had ill intentions just by his demeanor and looks of him. Likely would have done something bad had I not been there.